So we've all heard stories about how terrible Russian farming and factories were during the communist rule, but we never really get a good sense of why. Why did communism fail? I mean, here in the West, we have these sorts of arguments back and forth, and I thought it would be useful if we looked at a individual's first-hand account. So I want to read a blib from you. It's an author named Vladimir Bukovsky, and the book is To Build a Castle. So briefly, Vladimir Bukovsky was a Russian-born human rights activist and writer from the late 1950s to the mid 1970s. He was a prominent figure in the Soviet dissident movement and was well known at home and abroad. He spent a total of 12 years in psychiatric hospitals, labor camps, and prisons. Interestingly, reading the book, he spent a lot more time in psych wards. It seems anti-Soviet activity, which could have been anything, it's like getting canceled today. You often wound up in these crazy psych wards rather than prisons. And this also being post-Stalin, there had been some degree of reform in the whole prison system versus, the dark days of the gulags when Stalin ruled with an iron fist. In 2001, he received the Truman-Reagan Medal of Freedom, which was awarded by the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. So this guy was an ardent critic of communism. Now, also to give some context to his life, he grew up, he was a boy when Stalin was ruling. And it's interesting, he says, during his life, to the people of Russia, Stalin was regarded almost like a god king. He was practically worshipped. And he talked about Moscow when Stalin died. There were people weeping in the streets. It was this great national tragedy. People were beside themselves. And then slowly, as people were released from prison and the death grip on the news cycle began to break a little bit, they called it a thaw in the atrocities, stories began coming out about just how brutal and repressive Stalin was. And he said within 2 years' time, the very people who had worshipped Stalin and cried at his funeral hated his guts. It just took 2 years as truth came out, as light shined down on these atrocities. Now, quite obviously, Russia didn't transform into a capitalist, freedom-loving utopia. I shouldn't even use the word utopia. A freedom-oriented society. It's still the dream of communism continued on for decades more. But it's interesting to look at first-hand accounts. Why did the factories fail? Why did the farms fail? Why does Russia have bare shelves in their grocery store? Well, until the recent takeover by the lunatics we have today, America had more food and toilet paper than we could possibly ever go through. So let's look at this story he tells as a schoolboy. He's getting this, seems like a high school age. He writes, during the past few years, various reforms had been introduced into the educational system. Learning was no more varied or interesting, but additional absurdities and stupidities were superimposed. For example, somewhere in the higher echelons, it was decided that school was too divorced from life, that students were getting no training for work. As a result, special work lessons were introduced, followed by practical training on the job. 1 year, we had to work in a factory, and the following summer, we were sent out to work on a state farm near Moscow. This indeed widened our horizons, though not in the manner planned by our wise party. Working in a bus factory in Moscow, my classmates and I saw for the first time what a Soviet enterprise is like, with all its deceptions, its hollow facade, and its coercion. Nobody in the bus factory was in a hurry to work. The workers preferred to sit in the smoking room until the foreman appeared, when they all dashed to their places. "Why should we hurry for the money they pay us?" said the workman. "Work's not a wolf. It won't run into the forest." Sorry for the Russian accent. In the mornings, they were almost all drunk or hungover, and throughout the working day, people would regularly detailed to slip over the fence for some vodka. Only one man put in a full day's work. The rest hated him, and when pointing him out would rotate one finger meaningfully by the temple. They were always looking for chances to do him dirt, either by surreptitiously damaging his machine or by stealing his tools. "Want to be the champion and raise the targets?" they said spitefully. It turned out that if one man exceeded the target would be raised for all of them in the following month, and they would have to work twice as hard for exactly the same money. We quickly fell into their style of work. And they have this little poem, "Take the hammer, then the sickle, that do our Soviet land recall. Bang or reap, whichever you pick. It makes no odds, you'll get fuck all." The turner to whom I was assigned for training, a young fellow barely older than myself, had a most original way of meeting the target. Once the foreman had told him the total, he only pretended to work. Then, when the foreman wasn't around, he would creep up to the big wooden shed where the finished parts were kept. There were 2 loose boards at the back. Nipping inside, he would quickly locate the boxes he needed in the dark and stuff his pockets with the necessary parts. Then he returned to the workshop by a roundabout route and spent most of the working day in the smoking room. I don't think my teacher was the only one who was so crafty. He and I were the youngest in the workshop, so it was natural that one of us would be sent for vodka. The other stayed by the machine and pretended to be working. Toward the end of the day, everyone cheered up. There would be a spring in their step, and for some unaccountable reason, they kept slipping out of the building. They would come back holding loosely wrapped packets or cartons, and then one or the other of us young fellows would have to skip over the fence again and wait for them to pass the packets carefully over to us. They would then leave the boy by the proper exit and collect their booty. They stole practically anything that could be sold on the black market or used at home. One day, they stole a whole bus engine. Another, a roll of material for upholstering the seats. Paint, enamel, spare engine parts were taken as a matter of course. At the same time, the entire factory was festooned with colorful slogans and signs. "We'll give, we'll catch up, we'll overtake," together with rising production graphs and pictures of scrubbed and smiling workers with their sleeves rolled up. On the posters, factories such as ours were irresistibly storming the heights of communism. Our temporary attachment to an agricultural establishment was no less enlightening. We were taken out to the state farm one evening and ensconced in a barracks hut. We spent the night on wooden bunks. At the crack of dawn, we were awakened by a deafening burst of supernatural swearing. Tumbling out of the hut, we discovered a couple of dozen peasant women shoveling a heap of rotten potatoes into a truck and cussing Khrushchev simply for the sake of it, to make the work go quicker. These potatoes were being taken out into the fields for planting. How on earth did anyone expect them to grow? But nobody cared about that. The peasants explained to us that they were paid for every ton of potatoes planted, so what was harvested didn't interest them. Soon it turned cold, the rain set in, and we were sent out to weed beets by hand. This occupation struck us as absurd as planting those potatoes, which indeed it was. Naturally, the whole of this state farm was also hung about with posters, banners, production graphs, and pictures of plump cows and buxom milkmaids. The mud was impassable, and vodka had to be fetched by tractor. We were amazed to discover that the state farm workers were unable to resign or leave the farm since they weren't allowed to hold their own internal passports, and without a passport you were outside the law and could be arrested by the first town policeman to come across you. Oh boy, papers please. Nor could you get another job without a passport. Boys of our age were waiting for their call up into the army as salvation. When they finished their military service, there was a chance they might find a city job instead of having to go home. The young girls thought of nothing but how to marry a townie and get away. Drunkenness, brawls, and knife fights were daily occurrences. And so you could see this is why people say that capitalism is the worst system out there, except for all of the others, because everybody always acts in their own self-interest. Even if you do it in a communist, communalist way, it's just like that hard-working guy who everybody else in the factory sabotaged because he was going to make them work harder. They were interested only in what they could steal and having their life be as easy as possible. People always only act in self-interest. Capitalism harnesses that. Any other system fails because it ignores that basic human truth. So Bukovsky goes on to write, in later years, we were often astounded by the idiotic stubbornness of our authorities and their reluctance to look at the obvious facts, all of which did them catastrophic harm. This self-destructive obstinacy may strike us as incomprehensible, but that is because we forget that a regime of terror cannot behave otherwise. Where it differs from a democratic regime is precisely in not being responsive to public opinion. In such a state, the individual cannot have any rights. The least inalienable right possessed by a single individual instantly deprives the regime of a morsel of power. Every individual from childhood on must absorb the axiomatic fact that never, in any circumstances or by any means, will he be able to influence the regime one jot. No decisions can be made other than on initiatives from above. The regime is immovable, infallible, and intransigent, and the entire world is left with no choice but to accommodate itself to this fact. You may humbly beg its indulgence, but never demand your due. It doesn't require conscious citizens demanding legality, it requires slaves. In just the same way, it doesn't require partners, it requires satellites. Like a paranoiac obsessed by a fantastic idea, it cannot and will not recognize reality. It tries to realize its delirium and to enforce its criteria on everybody else. We shall never be rid of this terror, never acquire freedom and security until we refuse categorically to recognize this paranoid version of reality and oppose it to our own reality and our own values. Thousands of books have been written in the West and hundreds of different doctrines created by the most prominent politicians to find a compromise with this kind of regime. They are all evading the only correct solution: moral opposition. The pampered Western democracies have forgotten their past and their essence, namely that democracy is not a comfortable house, a handsome car, or an unemployment benefit, but above all the ability and desire to stand up for one's rights. Neither atom bombs, nor bloody dictatorships, nor theories of containment or convergence will save the democracies. We who were born and have grown up in an atmosphere of terror know of only one remedy: the position of a citizen. There is a qualitative distinction between the behavior of an individual and that of the human crowd in an extreme situation. A people, nation, class, party, or simple crowd cannot go beyond a certain limit in a crisis. The instinct of self-preservation proves too strong. They can sacrifice a part in the hope of saving the rest. They can break up into smaller groups and seek salvation that way, but this is their downfall. To be alone is an enormous responsibility. With his back to the wall, a man understands, I am the people, I am the nation, I am the party, I am the class, and there is nothing else at all. He cannot sacrifice a part of himself, cannot split himself up or divide into parts and still live. There is nowhere for him to retreat to, and the instinct of self-preservation drives him to extremes. He prefers physical death to spiritual death, and an astonishing thing happens. In fighting to preserve his integrity, he is simultaneously fighting for his people, his class, or his party. It is such individuals who win the right for their communities to live, even perhaps if they are not thinking of it at the time. Why should I do it? Asks each man in the crowd. I can do nothing alone. And they are all lost. If I don't do it, who will? Asks the man with his back to the wall, and everyone is saved. This is how a man begins building his castle.